A boy is taken from his mother's arms in a Balkan village, and by the time he is a grown man, he will be one of the most feared soldiers on earth, and he will not remember her face. That is where the story begins, not on a battlefield, but in a doorway, in a moment of loss so ordinary that it happened to tens of thousands of families across 2 centuries, and out of that loss the Ottoman Empire built a machine of war so effective that it reshaped the map of 3 continents. For nearly 500 years, the Ottoman state expanded from a small frontier principality in Anatolia into an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Historians believe the engine behind much of that expansion was not simply numbers or geography, but a single military institution, one built deliberately, patiently, and with a coldness that still unsettles people who study it today. That institution was the Janissary Corps. What makes this story different from most tales of ancient conquest is that it is not really about a battle, or even a series of battles. It is about design. Somewhere in the 14th century, a small ruling elite in Anatolia looked at the problem of building a loyal army and arrived at an answer so ruthless in its logic that it would outlast dozens of sultans, reshape the demographics of the Balkans, and eventually turn against the very throne it was built to protect. Few institutions in world history have ever been engineered this deliberately, and few have ever collapsed this violently under the weight of their own success. The Corps traces its origins to the 14th century, most likely established under Sultan Orhan, one of the earliest rulers of the fledgling Ottoman state. At that time, the Ottomans faced a familiar problem for any expanding power. Their armies depended on feudal cavalry and tribal levies, men whose loyalty belonged first to their own chieftains, and only second to the Sultan. A ruler who depends on other men's soldiers is never fully secure, and the early Ottoman sultans understood this with unusual clarity. So they built something new, a standing force that would owe its existence, its training, its food, and its very identity to one man alone, the Sultan himself. To build that force, they turned to a practice that still generates fierce debate among historians, a levy known as the devshirme. Government officials moved through conquered Christian territories in the Balkans, through what is now Albania, Bosnia, Serbia, Greece, and beyond, and they selected boys, usually somewhere between the ages of 8 and 18, from Christian families. According to most historical accounts, the officials looked for physical strength, intelligence, and a certain bearing, boys who looked like they could survive what was coming. The boys were taken from their homes, their names were changed, they were converted to Islam, and in most cases, subjected to forced circumcision as part of that conversion. Try to imagine it from the inside for a moment. A mother in a mountain village hears that officials are coming through the district again. She does not know if her son will be chosen. There is no appeal, no negotiation that reliably works, no promise that she will ever see him again. Some families, historians note, actually attempted to bribe officials either to take their sons because the Corps eventually offered real advancement, or to leave them behind because the terror of the unknown outweighed any future privilege. Both reactions tell you something about how total this system was. It did not simply recruit soldiers, it rewired entire families' relationships with the state that ruled them. Once selected, the boys did not go straight into military life. Many were first sent to live and labor with Turkish families in Anatolia, where, according to historical sources, they learned the Turkish language, adopted local customs, and were hardened by physical work before ever touching a weapon. Records describe this period lasting 3 to 4 years. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate stripping away of the old identity, piece by piece, until the boy who had once belonged to a Balkan village belonged now, in every way that mattered, to the Sultan's household. From there, the ones judged strong enough entered what was called the Asemi Oglan Corps, a preparatory school whose very name simply meant new or foreign boy. And there they remained for another 7 to 8 years, sometimes longer, under conditions historians describe as practically monastic, hard labor, strict celibacy, constant discipline. Only after this entire span, often close to a decade, did a young man face a formal examination, remembered in Ottoman records as going out the door, before finally being permitted to join the true ranks of the Janissary Corps itself. typically around the age of 24 or 25. Consider what that means. A boy taken at 8 or 10 years old might not become a full Janissary until he was closer to 25, which means the Corps did not simply train soldiers, it grew them across the entire span of a childhood and young adulthood, inside a system that controlled every input along the way. Not every boy followed the same path. The most physically striking were sometimes selected for palace service instead of the battlefield, and the sharpest minds among them were funneled into what was called the inner school, where boys who had been taken from illiterate peasant households in the Balkans found themselves studying Islamic theology, foreign languages, mathematics, and the fine points of diplomatic protocol, being groomed not for the front line, but for the highest offices of Ottoman administration. It is a detail worth sitting with, that some of the empire's most influential statesmen, men who would go on to shape imperial policy from within the palace walls, began their lives as anonymous captured children from villages most of the court would never think to visit. The training itself aimed to produce two things at once: soldiers who could fight with total commitment and yet remain bound psychologically to the only family they now knew, the Corps itself. The palace understood something modern institutions still wrestle with: that raw physical toughness without discipline produces chaos, while discipline without loyalty produces rebellion. That bond was reinforced through a set of restrictions that would strike most people today as extraordinary. Janissaries were, in a formal legal sense, slaves of the Sultan, and yet they were paid a regular salary, an arrangement almost unheard of elsewhere in the world at that time. They were forbidden to marry for much of their service, forbidden to grow beards, permitted only a mustache, forbidden to engage in ordinary trade. Their world was built to have no other loyalty in it, no wife waiting at home, no business partner to answer to, no family name to protect except the Corps' own reputation. Historians studying the system note that this near-total isolation is exactly what made the Janissaries function less like a conscripted army and more like a religious order that happened to carry rifles and blades. And it worked for a while in ways that changed the course of European and Middle Eastern history. Before we get to the battlefield, picture what an enemy soldier standing on a distant wall would actually have seen and heard approaching. The Janissaries did not simply march, they announced themselves. Their uniforms were built to be unmistakable: bright red caftans, leather vests worked with golden thread, tall white felt headgear shaped like a folded sleeve that made each soldier look inches taller than he was. And ahead of them, or alongside them, marched a military band unlike anything most European armies had ever organized. The Metter, generally regarded as one of the oldest military marching bands in the world. Drums, cymbals, and reed instruments produced a wall of sound deliberately engineered to unsettle an enemy line before a single blade was drawn. According to historical accounts, this band played for the Sultan and his forces as a matter of law and custom, and its droning, hammering rhythm became so associated with Ottoman assault that European composers centuries later would borrow its style to evoke exotic menace in concert halls, far from any battlefield. Long before psychological warfare had a name, the Janissaries were already practicing it, with color, height, and sound, before a single shot was fired. By the time the Ottomans stood before the walls of Constantinople in 1453, the Janissaries had already become the disciplined corps the Sultan needed for the most consequential siege of the century. The city had resisted conquest for over 1,000 years. Its triple line of land walls was considered, according to most historical accounts, the most sophisticated defensive fortification in the medieval world, and generations of would-be conquerors had broken themselves against it. For weeks that spring, the young Sultan Mehmed II's forces battered those walls with massive siege cannon, while inside the city, a defending garrison that historians estimate numbered only a few thousand professional soldiers tried to hold the perimeter stretching for miles. When the final assault came, it was Janissary regiments, pressed forward in relentless waves under cover of that deafening Metter music, who eventually found and forced the breach that 8 centuries of previous attackers had never managed to open. And yet the empire that finally broke through relied heavily on a corps of soldiers who, within living memory, had themselves been Christian children taken from conquered towns. There is a bitter irony historians frequently point to, that the empire's most formidable weapon against Christian Europe was, at its foundation, built from Christian Europe's own sons. What made them so effective was not simply bravery, which ordinary conscripts could also show, but consistency. Feudal levies scattered when their local lord fell or lost interest. Mercenaries left when the money ran short. Janissaries did neither, because they had nowhere else to go and no other identity to retreat into. In an era when most armies were unpredictable coalitions of self-interest, the Ottomans fielded a corps that behaved, in essence, like a machine with human parts. By the late 15th century, the corps numbered somewhere around 8,000 active soldiers, a small fraction of the total Ottoman military, but wildly disproportionate in influence and effectiveness. As the empire expanded through the 16th century, so did the corps, crossing 20,000 men by its later decades. This was the era of Suleiman the Magnificent, when Ottoman power reached deep into Hungary and pressed against the heart of Central Europe, following the decisive victory at Mohacs in 1526, and the Janissaries stood at the center of nearly every major campaign, feared not simply for their numbers but for their coordinated firepower, since they were among the earliest infantry forces in the world to be extensively equipped with firearms, rather than relying primarily on cavalry and cold steel. The campaigns of this period read like a steady march northward and westward. Belgrade fell in 1521. The island fortress of Rhodes, held for centuries by the Knights Hospitaller, fell the following year after a siege historians describe as brutal and prolonged. Then came Mohacs in 1526, where the Ottoman army crushed the forces of the Kingdom of Hungary in a single afternoon so decisive that it effectively ended Hungary as an independent medieval kingdom. And by 1529, Ottoman forces were camped outside the walls of Vienna itself, further into the heart of Europe than any Muslim army had reached in centuries. At the center of nearly every one of these victories, according to most historical accounts, stood the disciplined firepower and unwavering formation of the Janissary infantry. Functioning as the anchor around which the rest of the Ottoman war machine, its cavalry, its artillery, its irregular raiders, could maneuver with confidence. What made this even more formidable was the machine built around them. According to historical accounts, the Janissaries campaigned with a level of logistical support that few of their European rivals could match. Entire support corps, whose job was to prepare the roads ahead of the advancing army, pitch the tents, and bake the bread that would feed thousands of men marching deep into hostile territory. An army that eats reliably and sleeps under cover, even 1,000 miles from home, holds together in ways that a starving, improvising army cannot. This was not glamorous work, but historians increasingly argue it may have mattered as much as any charge or siege tactic in explaining why Ottoman campaigns could be sustained across such vast distances for so many consecutive seasons. And when the campaigning season ended, the Janissaries did not simply vanish back into barracks to wait. In the empire's capital, they served as police, patrolling the streets of Istanbul, and remarkably, as the city's firefighters, a role that placed the empire's most feared soldiers in the position of protecting the very civilians whose sons had, a generation earlier, been the ones taken by the devshirme. There was even a tradition, historians note, in which the Sultan himself, after authorizing the corps' regular pay, would visit the barracks dressed as an ordinary Janissary trooper and collect his own wage alongside the men of the 1st Division, a small theatrical gesture meant to reinforce the fiction that Sultan and soldier were bound together as one family, however unequal that family truly was. Here is where the story starts to turn, though, because the very qualities that made the corps so effective also planted the seed of what would eventually destroy it. A soldier who owes everything to the state and nothing to any family or faction is a loyal soldier, only as long as the state continues to give him a reason to be loyal. And by the late 16th century, something had begun to shift, quietly at first, in ways that most people watching from outside the empire would never have noticed. The strict celibacy rule began to loosen. Restrictions on trade were relaxed, and most significantly, the exclusive recruitment through the devshirme system began to break down as the corps opened its ranks to freeborn Muslim Turks and eventually even allowed positions to become something close to hereditary. Sons of Janissaries began entering the corps not because they had proven themselves through the brutal selection and training process, but simply because of who their fathers were. Think about what that quietly destroyed. The entire design of the original system depended on total outsiders, boys with no local family ties, no competing loyalties, no path back into ordinary society. Once the corps filled with men who had fathers, uncles, property, and inherited privilege within the ranks, it stopped being an isolated tool of the Sultan and started becoming something far more dangerous, a self-interested political faction wearing the uniform of the state's own army. The daily texture of life inside the corps changed too, in ways that were small individually but enormous cumulatively. Men who were once forbidden even to grow a beard now took up trades on the side, running shops, workshops, and stalls throughout Istanbul while still drawing a soldier's salary. Coffee houses and guild networks tied Janissaries into the ordinary commercial life of the capital in ways the original founders of the corps would have found almost unrecognizable. A soldier with a shop to protect, a family to feed, and a network of fellow tradesmen to answer to is, by definition, no longer the isolated instrument the devshirme system was built to produce. He now has interests of his own, interests that might not align with whatever the Sultan's court decided was best for the empire that season. This mattered enormously the moment anyone tried to change anything, because the corps had become so deeply woven into the economic and social fabric of the capital. Any sultan who proposed reducing its size, cutting its pay, or replacing its outdated tactics with modern training was not simply challenging a military unit, he was threatening thousands of small businesses, family incomes, and neighborhood power structures all at once. Reform, in other words, had stopped being a purely military decision. It had become an act that could ignite a city. By the turn of the 17th century, this shift had already produced consequences the earliest sultans would have found unthinkable. The Janissaries, once the loyal instrument that enforced the sultan's will, increasingly became the force that decided who got to hold that will in the first place. Historians describe repeated episodes across the 17th and 18th centuries in which the corps rioted, deposed sultans, and installed replacements more to their liking, essentially functioning as a kind of armed political party garrisoned in the imperial capital itself. Now pause and reconsider everything you thought you knew about this story so far. This was not simply a tale of an unstoppable military machine conquering everything before it. It was the story of an empire that built the most effective army of its age, and then slowly, almost invisibly, watched that same army turn its discipline inward, using its cohesion not to expand the empire's borders, but to protect its own privileges at the empire's expense. By the late 17th century, the numbers alone tell part of the story. The corps swelled to roughly 67,000 men by around 1699, a staggering figure compared to the original 8,000. But this growth did not mean growing strength. According to most historical accounts, much of that expansion came from padded roles, men enrolled on paper to collect salaries while providing little genuine military value, alongside declining standards of training and discipline as merit-based selection gave way to inherited privilege. An institution built to be lean, ruthless, and unbreakable had become bloated, entitled, and resistant to any reform that threatened its comfortable position at the heart of Ottoman society. It is worth pausing on how counterintuitive this pattern actually is. We tend to assume that an institution grows stronger as it grows larger, that more soldiers on the payroll must mean more soldiers ready for war. The Janissary Corps quietly disproves that assumption. Its real strength in the 15th and 16th centuries came from scarcity, from the fact that only a small, ruthlessly selected fraction of the empire's young men were ever allowed to earn the title at all. Once that scarcity disappeared, once the title could be inherited rather than earned through a decade of monastic training and brutal winnowing, the number on the muster rolls kept climbing even as the average soldier's usefulness on an actual battlefield kept falling. Numbers, in other words, had become a mask for weakness rather than a measure of strength, and for a long time nobody in a position to fix it had the power or the will to try. Meanwhile, the wider world was not standing still. European militaries were modernizing rapidly, adopting new tactics, new artillery systems, new forms of centralized training that the aging Janissary structure increasingly failed to match. The very institution that once represented cutting-edge military innovation had, over generations, calcified into something closer to a hereditary guild jealously guarding its privileges, rather than a force built for the battlefields of a changing world. When Ottoman forces suffered the defeat outside Vienna in 1683, and faced a string of difficult campaigns in the decades that followed, military reformers within the empire increasingly pointed to the Janissaries themselves as part of the problem rather than the solution, and this created an impossible situation for the sultans who came after. Every ruler who wished to modernize the Ottoman military eventually confronted the same obstacle: a core so entrenched in the capital, so politically powerful, and so willing to riot or depose a sultan who threatened its privileges, that reform itself became an act of extraordinary personal risk. Multiple sultans attempted limited changes. Multiple sultans were removed, in some cases killed, for trying. One earlier attempt, a generation before, is worth remembering here because it shows just how long this problem had been building and how high the personal cost of confronting it could rise. Sultan Selim III had tried, in the 1790s, to build a new-style army trained along modern European lines, equipped with European weapons and uniforms, hoping it might eventually stand alongside, or even replace, the aging Janissary establishment. The Janissaries and their conservative allies saw this new force for exactly what it threatened to become: a rival that could make their own privileges unnecessary. And the backlash grew until, in 1807, mutinous troops forced Selim's abdication. He was imprisoned within his own palace. The following year, according to historical accounts, he was killed on the order of the cousin who had briefly replaced him, and it was only a chaotic counter-coup arriving almost too late that placed the last surviving male heir, a young prince named Mahmud, on the throne instead. Mahmud had watched, from inside that same palace, exactly what happened to a sultan who moved against the Janissaries, without enough patience or enough force behind him. He would not make the same mistake. The lesson was not lost on him. Reform could not be announced. It would have to be prepared quietly for years, and then executed all at once, before the core had any chance to organize against it. It took until the early 19th century for a ruler to finally break the deadlock, and the man who did it approached the problem with a patience that itself tells you how dangerous the core had become. Sultan Mahmud II spent years quietly building a modern, loyal alternative force, gathering allies among reform-minded officials and religious authorities, and waiting for the right moment to confront an institution that had, by then, existed for nearly 500 years. That moment came in June of 1826. By then, according to historical accounts, Mahmud had spent close to 2 decades carefully isolating the Janissaries, politically, winning over religious authorities who had once automatically sided with the core, and quietly building a smaller, loyal, modern-trained force that could act when the moment finally arrived. When the Janissaries rose in open rebellion against his new reformed troops, as historians describe it, Mahmud moved with a decisiveness the core almost certainly did not expect from a sultan they had spent generations learning to intimidate. Loyalist artillery was wheeled into position around the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. According to most historical accounts, when the Janissaries refused to disperse, those barracks were bombarded and set ablaze, and the core was crushed within a matter of hours in what came to be known afterward as the Auspicious Incident, a name that itself reveals how the Ottoman state wanted this event remembered, not as a massacre, but as a liberation. Survivors were killed, exiled, or scattered across the empire. The devshirme system that had once fed the core had already been abandoned generations earlier, and the institution that had once stormed the walls of Constantinople and stood at the gates of Vienna was formally abolished by imperial decree, never to be reconstituted as a fighting force again. Even the Meterband, that same music once designed to terrify enemies on distant battlefields, was disbanded alongside the soldiers it had marched beside for centuries, replaced within a few years by a European-style military band trained under a foreign bandmaster. A small but telling detail of just how completely Mahmud intended to sever the empire from this chapter of its own military identity. Consider the strange justice folded into that ending. An institution originally created by tearing boys away from their families and stripping them of every prior loyalty, in order to bind them completely to the state, was ultimately destroyed by that same state, once those bonds of total loyalty had curdled into something the Sultan could no longer control. The machine that had been built to have no independent will of its own had over centuries developed exactly that, and paid for it with its existence. It is worth remembering, too, that this was never a simple story of villains and victims frozen in time. The very same devshirme system that inflicted such loss on Balkan Christian families also, according to historians who study the core, opened a path to genuine power and status for some of those same families' descendants. Men who rose from captured peasant boys to grand viziers, provincial governors, and commanders whose word could move armies. That contradiction does not soften what the system took from the families who lived through it. It simply reminds us that empires rarely build anything, even their instruments of conquest, out of pure cruelty or pure opportunity alone. They tend to build out of both at once, tangled together in ways that resist a tidy verdict centuries later. What remains today is not simply a story about a military unit, but a case study historians still return to again and again, about how institutions built for total control can, given enough time and enough drift from their original purpose, become the very threat they were designed to prevent. The Janissaries did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the system that made them extraordinarily effective in one era eventually made them extraordinarily resistant to the reforms the next era demanded. Walk through Istanbul today, and the Janissaries have not entirely vanished. Historical accounts note that in the 20th century, long after the empire itself had ended, the Turkish state revived the Mehterband as a ceremonial and cultural tradition, and it now performs at the military museum, and during national commemorations, musicians in replica red and gold uniforms playing rhythms whose original purpose was to announce conquest, now repurposed to mark memory instead. It is a strange kind of afterlife for an institution that once made emperors from Vienna to Isfahan take notice, reduced now to a ceremonial echo of the machine it used to be, and yet still recognizable enough that people gather to watch it, centuries after the barracks burned. There is something almost universal hiding inside this 500-year story, something that reaches well beyond the specific politics of the Ottoman court. Every institution that depends on total control, whether it is a 14th-century sultan's army or something far more modern, faces the same quiet tension over time. The tighter the control at the founding, the more the founders can trust the institution to do exactly what it was built for. But control this total is expensive to maintain, and expensive things get worn down, corner by corner, generation by generation, until one day the people running the institution look up and realize the thing they built to serve them has quietly started serving itself instead. The Ottomans discovered this the hard way, over 5 centuries, at a cost measured in burned barracks and murdered sultans. It is a lesson written in fire across the history of an empire, and it did not stay buried with the Janissaries either, because versions of it keep reappearing, in different centuries, in different countries, wearing different uniforms. So here is the question worth sitting with. If an institution can be engineered this precisely, stripped of family, loyalty, and identity, and rebuilt entirely around obedience to a single authority, and still, after enough generations, bend that same design toward self-preservation instead of duty, what does that tell us about the limits of any system that depends on total control to function? I would love to hear what you think the real turning point was in this story, whether it was the loosening of the original recruitment rules, the hereditary privileges that crept in, or something else entirely. So drop your answer in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the empires, machines, and men history remembers and the ones it quietly forgets, make sure you subscribe for what comes next.